When you guys went public along with Field Trip, you were often compared.
Hmm.
If you're sitting in front of a group of investors right now, what's the best way of describing how Numinus differentiates
Sure.
itself from Field Trip Health? Hey everyone, welcome to this TDR Psychedelic Exclusive. Great to have you on. We're talking psychedelics today. Some big announcements regarding some big notable names last week that we touched on in our Trade to Black podcast. We wanted to talk a little bit more, and no other better person than bringing on one of the best well-known CEOs in the space, the CEO of Numinus Wellness, which trades on the TSX under the ticker symbol NUMI. Payton Nyquvest, back to the podcast. Good day, sir. Hope you're doing well.
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Before we get into some of these announcements last week, I actually do want to touch on one of the announcement that your company made. You've expanded your clinical research capabilities into the state of Arizona. This is the third clinical trial research site in the U.S. and fifth overall, which is going to boost your capability of services for your contract research organization division, Cedar Clinical Research. So sum this up for us. What capabilities does this expansion achieve beyond what you're able to provide clients before?
Yeah, I think the thing that our research arm has really been able to show is excellence in regards to being able to hold clinical trials, and we've coupled that with showing that it's also, quite an important part of our business from a margin perspective. We reported on our last quarters, our research business did over 60% profit margins, so it's lucrative for us. But it continues to thrive, and so the opportunity to continue to expand is a big one for us. And it also allows us, those are done within our existing clinics in Arizona, and so it allows us to continue to have a number of these different psychedelic treatments being run within our clinical infrastructure before they're approved. And we've talked about this before, but clients like MindMed and USONA and MAPS, who we've run clinical trials for, we get to run those in our clinics. And so it gets us very familiar with them, and it gets us a better understanding of what do we need to build on the clinic side. So when those therapies are approved, there's a natural fit for them and an ability to operate.
I got to ask, where do you feel overall as a company right now where you're sitting? Because like I said, we've seen some interesting announcements recently in the space, but you've gotten some great feedback from some analysts in the US. The acquisition, we can't talk enough in previous podcasts about the acquisition of Novavine and your partnerships with MAPS. But right now, mentally, as a company, what's the sentiment, and how strong do you feel about everything that's moving forward as we progress here in 2023?
And I'll maybe sound like a little bit of a broken record, but I couldn't be more proud and excited about where the company is and where we see things headed in the near future. We've talked about our previous financials. We've shown not just the ability to execute, but a really big opportunity in regards to now having a foundational platform that we can expand on. And coupled with, obviously, from a approval standpoint, our partnership with MAPS, as you said, MAPS is, right close to having MDMA approved, which is huge. We continue to be able to provide more accessibility for our clients, increased payer opportunities for our ketamine services, diversity of services in regards to different mental health treatments. And then, you're seeing huge amount of regulatory support for this as well. The huge change in Australia, continuing changes happening in Canada, the state by state level in the US. And it's, coming at a time where we need a lot more practitioners trained. We need a lot more sites that can administer these therapies, but do so in a scalable and sustainable way.
Do you think we get an announcement in Canada similar to what happened in Australia in the near future? Will it happen? And if so, do you think it'll happen sooner rather than later?
It's a good question. I certainly think so. From what we continue to see in Canada, I think there's a keen interest in a more broad regulatory change. Alberta has already made that change, which is kind of, it's similar in some ways to what happened in Australia. But I think the pressure's on Health Canada, and from what we've seen, there's not necessarily a lot of resistance there.
Hmm.
I think what's exciting about that from our standpoint is, it makes the competitiveness in regards to the cost of the drug, which ultimately contributes to the cost of the therapy. It brings that down. There's no real IP protection around the drug itself, which makes it much more accessible for
Right.
clients. And we have a universal healthcare system, so it should be paid
Yeah.
for
Good
as
point.
well.
I bring up the whole idea of like where you are mentally as far as like the company where it sits right now, because when we look at the macro view of the psychedelic industry, which is really struggling to gain some traction on the capital market side, despite some amazing research coming from MAPS, small pharma, and others. Look, the science of psychedelic assisted therapy, it's like ironclad right now.
Hmm.
Yet the equity continues to languish. So, saying that, what do you think it's going to take to get institutional investors, I guess, really excited? Like, I've heard stuff that, yes, they're excited, but beyond that, what is the announcement that we're going to have to hear, besides the obvious of tier one exchange listings to get this to a turning point within the industry?
To be honest, I don't know if it's necessarily like a big announcement that is going to
Okay.
be the turning point. I think ultimately, and this is what we continue to hear, and I know the feedback that a lot of the big drug developers are getting is to your point. Like the feedback is, look, like we know that your drugs work.
Hmm.
We're confident in that. You need to show us how this is going to integrate into society and how ultimately it's going to make money. And, that's frankly, I think where Numinus has a huge opportunity is we've been able to demonstrate how that's going to happen. And we've created a platform where, we can be partnering and collaborating with these larger drug developers who need a service infrastructure like ours in order
Yeah.
to actually integrate and engage with clients. And
Yeah.
so it's an exciting time. I think, you know, unfortunately, it has been challenging out there, and I think not undeserved, frankly. Things
Yeah.
were very, very frothy a while
Yeah.
ago, and some groups were smart enough to recognize that, raise money, and build real value for shareholders, and unfortunately, some others just weren't able to make that happen. And the disappointing thing is, you hate to see um, investors who in this space, I think are really passionate about trying to support change in the largest societal issue that I think we
Yeah.
have at the moment, and
Yeah.
and that's unfortunate. And frankly, the more unfortunate thing is the amount of people that are looking for and waiting for these kinds of treatments is overwhelming. And as organizations making pretty bold pretty bold statements in terms of what we're committing to, we have to make good on those commitments.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because there is an unfathomable amount of people that need this kind of support, and
Yeah,
we.
I mentioned this in a previous podcast on our Trade to Black that there was a report from the CDC where 1 in 3 high school girls have contemplated suicide. I
Yeah.
could not believe when I read that stat, 1 in 3. I want to get back to, I mentioned tier one exchange listings for institutions to get interested. We
Mhm.
bring this up obviously at the top of our podcast all the time about how you trade on the TSX under the ticker symbol NUMI.
Yep.
I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper as to what that means as a TSX issuer. So maybe explain to investors and differentiate to our viewers the advantages that you have, say, versus other psychedelic companies that are on smaller exchanges in terms of lower liquidity profiles and weaker disclosure standards. How do things like this work for people to get a better idea of the advantages of being on an exchange like the TSX?
I think the biggest thing should be confidence. It's a rigorous process to get onto some of those higher tiered exchanges,
Yeah.
and the amount of due diligence that needs to be done in order to get those approvals is a lot. And so I think if investors take away one thing, it's the confidence that there's been significant due diligence that's been done. and the encouragement of obviously best practices in order to keep that listing. So I think, that's important for investors to consider. I think also with that, good corporate governance, which
Yes.
Is a big one.
Big.
Is really what's prioritized on those bigger exchanges as well. So
Yeah. Good point.
yeah.
I would think that institutions, as you've said to us in the past, want to see a pathway to revenue. So as we saw these quote unquote frothy stories in the past, and there's less companies around, we saw a lot of institutions spend a lot of money towards this industry 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
If we get FDA approval for MDMA within the next, say 9 months, you know, how much more do you think institutions will contribute towards this industry in comparison to say 2 years ago? Do you think it'll be a lot more?
I think so. I think, and you typically see this in cycles. You saw this in the cannabis space. You've seen it in other spaces as well, where, the sort of like larger, more sophisticated institutions don't necessarily come in at the first opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
They let organizations start. They let the, more frothy capital come in. And there's always an inevitable consolidation. And out of that consolidation, that's where you really find, who are the ones that are going to, really be able to take off and take advantage of the opportunity. And I think that's what they're doing now. I think, the capital that is there. And I think talking maybe healthcare more broadly, there isn't a sector that's worse performed over the last couple of years than healthcare, which probably I know makes no sense for me and probably doesn't make any sense for most of others as well. But I think, the comeback or the bounce back from the challenging times that healthcare have had, especially again now going into, I think from a mental health perspective, we're only just starting to see the ramifications of COVID. We just recently got the updated overdose numbers and suicide numbers. It's
staggering.
It is. Yeah, it's really scary. It's really, really scary. And,
what I was thinking the other day is cannabis space has been back and forth with this Safe Banking Act for years. And it doesn't seem like it's any closer today than what it was 3-4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You guys have in a lot of ways your own safe banking bill in some ways is that when you approve MDMA, psilocybin, when that announcement gets made, I'm sure who knows what happens with regards to other compounds.
Yep.
But that's the equivalence as to like what this announcement could be, compared to. And here we are looking at years and years of progress. There's so much interest regarding cannabis and what it could become. And very quietly behind the scenes is your industry that's moving so fast when it comes to science. And more importantly, it's a need and it works. And there's years of data.
Yeah.
But would you not say that this announcement with FDA approval to MDMA is just as big as, say, a safe banking in cannabis?
100%. And I think, I think sometimes that gets misconstrued a little bit in the psychedelic spaces. Is it going to have the same integration challenges that cannabis has had? And
of course,
it's not even the same conversation.
Yeah.
With whether it's FDA clinical trials or the kind of approval that could happen, like what happened in Australia, is these are modalities integrated into the healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to build a whole new pathway to addressing clients like cannabis did. These, even our ketamine services is an example. Our ketamine services 80% of them get covered under insurance at the moment. I think even if you look at what's happened with the special access program in Canada, you've now had Health Canada pay for 2 people to get psilocybin therapy. Before it's approved, Health Canada is already paying for it. Right. So, that like the ability once approval happens for this to really ramp up significantly is really, really, I think something that can't be understated.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on here today, the 2 big announcements last week, Cybin announced that they're laying 15% of their staff off, unrelated to specifically the trials itself, which I can understand why during these times. The other was Field Trip Health. They pushed out a press release last week how they basically formed an independent committee to explore strategic options, in part because of the difficult raising capital in these current market conditions.
Mm-hmm.
When you guys went public along with Field Trip, you were often compared.
Mm-hmm.
If you're sitting in front of a group of investors right now, what's the best way of describing how Numinus differentiates itself from Field Trip Health?
I mean, to be totally honest, it's a completely different business. And it's always easy to, hindsight's always 2020
Yep.
and what have you. And it's very unfortunate what's happening with Field Trip, for all the reasons I mentioned at the top of the podcast. But we've always looked at psychedelics, and our involvement with psychedelics is psychedelics are a tool in the toolbox of this bigger thing we're trying to address in regards to mental health care. And Numinus has a diversity of services, and we approach this space, frankly, we're the team that leads this company. Majority of us are patients. Myself included. I come to this space as a patient. I've had my life saved by psychedelic therapy, but it was only one part of what I was doing. Was it the sort of catalytic part of my journey? For sure. But we approach it from that knowledge and that mindset. And so for us as a business, we've diversified the business in regards to services to make sure that there's something that is scalable, and sustainable, as robustly and quickly as possible. And that's, you can ask anybody on the team. The mandate that I gave the team from the very first day that we started the company is, because I actually never planned on taking Numinus public, was this has got to be profitable and make money in order to actually create lasting change. And that's always been the viewpoint of the organization. So we're a diversified mental health service provider who, has very deep ties to the psychedelic space, and certainly is I would say at the core of what Numinus is and what we stand for. But we've always looked at, how do we build something that can sustain, and be scalable, and how do we not rely on the capital markets for capital, as quickly as possible.
Well, I think the big thing, as I said before, is that people understand your model and your story now, and really understand the importance of those partnerships, including Cantor analyst Pavlo Zwenich, who wrote last week that you're well positioned over the next year as far as your current cash position. Like to get an idea, obviously, on how things are progressing with regards to the burn rate, but that announcement was a feather in the cap. So let's walk us through a year from now. MDMA is now approved. I got to say that right, because somebody came out the other day and commented on how I didn't pronounce it right. So make sure that's correct. But MDMA is now approved. How does your company specifically benefit in comparison to others?
So I think, and we've talked about this before, but where we've positioned ourselves and what we've always built the company based off of, and this is maybe going back to your first question around, what's different between us and Field Trip and maybe some of the other providers in the spaces. We've always built the organization to not just solely focus on ketamine, or MDMA or psilocybin, but to be a service provider that can house these different treatments. And so with that, we've built an infrastructure, training programs, and partnerships with who we believe are sort of the industry leaders, where approval is going to happen first.
Right.
And obviously MAPS is the very top of that list. And we've worked with MAPS for a number of years now. And, for us, from a benefit perspective, if you look at burn rate and our projections, we've shown a very clear path to profitability just with the services that we provide today and just with the infrastructure that we provide today. MDMA is going to be I'm hesitant to use the word lucrative, but it's going to be.
It'll help.
It'll help a lot. It's an extraordinarily, from what we've seen from the clinical trials, an extraordinarily successful treatment, a very sought after treatment, and one that should be fully covered. MAPS anticipates being fully covered under insurance day one. And so for us to be able to incorporate that program, as robustly as we can. And I use the word robustly because not only have we actually administered the protocol in our existing clinical sites, but we've trained a large number of practitioners. We've figured out how to prepare clients, do integrations, diagnosings, all of the kind of nuts and bolts parts of this that people don't really consider. It's if you think about what it would take to do open heart surgery, for example, right? It's not as easy as like, oh, here's a scalpel, now you can do open heart surgery. There's a lot that goes into building that infrastructure to be able to do it well and ensure success. And that's what we've been working with MAPS on to build over the last couple of years. So day one of approval, we'll be able to not just be able to offer MDMA, but do so in a very significant way.
Are you able to share the amount of numbers of like people that you've trained or on track? Because as we said before in some of the interviews in the past, there's many as 50, 60,000 they're going to need across the world over the next 18 months. But I hear different numbers from anywhere from a couple hundred for some companies to I don't really know what the proper amount where some investor could say, wow, that's like a great job. They're pacing themselves. But curious to know if you could actually outline a number of trained therapists that you're currently training.
Yeah, so we have close to a couple hundred therapists on our own roster at the moment, about 150. And some of those are contractors, some of those are employee. We see the opportunity to grow that significantly. But we've also offered, so not only is there the MAPS training, but we offer a number of different trainings as well that allow for everybody from a non-registered, non-licensed person who wants to become an MDMA therapist to the person who has lots of registration that is looking to just understand MDMA therapy in particular, or psilocybin or ketamine. We've built a large training network because ultimately I think that's the largest bottleneck in the psychedelic space is trained practitioners. And I think your comment around, I think you said 60,000 therapists. I think that's light, to be honest.
Really?
If you look at, actually, it's interesting, and I'll send this to you, but the recent job numbers just came out, and coming out of COVID, the number two most signed up for schooling for profession was psychology and in particular psychologists. So you're seeing a huge increase in people looking to become mental health providers. And I think with that, MAPS currently at the moment has trained 1,500 practitioners. So it's a very far cry from 60,000. And
what's the process look like? Like, let's say, okay, I'm signing up. I want to learn to the point where you're fully licensed and ready to take part in psychedelic assisted therapy. Like, what is a timeline of education when people are enrolled?
It totally depends on what your previous education is like, but it's not it's not a weekend crash course. It's pretty intensive, and I think the thing that,
is it a 6 months? Is it a year?
It's a couple of months with and again depending on the registration, but I would say minimum a couple of months. I think the important thing to recognize as well, and this is where I think MAPS is going to be where maybe some of their challenge is going to be, frankly, is around you need to make sure that the quality and the barrier, and this is where Numinus's ethos has been, is we want to make sure that we're keeping the highest standard for client care. And that really, the cornerstone of that is training. And, there's going to be, and we've already seen this in the ketamine space where, there's lots of ketamine work happening at the moment, and we get a huge amount of people who reach out to us looking to do ketamine with us because they've had really challenging ketamine experiences somewhere else. And we really want to make sure that Numinus exists far beyond any bad news story that might and will inevitably happen. There's going to be lots of success stories, and there's going to be challenging ones, and we want to make sure that we can separate ourselves from that and keep ourselves to a standard that we believe is necessary.
Do you not think Compass, when they went public, really opened up a lot of people's eyes in this industry. When I look at MAPS, have they ever considered going public? And if they did, do you think that would be an announcement similar on par with like Compass going public? Like it would definitely take it mainstream in some ways that Compass did?
Yeah, I think MAPS is probably evaluating a couple different options at the moment in regards to raising money. I think.
Do you not think even like with Rick Doblin at the forefront in the interviews that he's doing, that's going to garner a lot of interest, would it not?
I think so for sure. I think, if you look at what MAPS has got over the next couple of months, they're going to report their phase 3B results. I think probably maybe sometime March or April.
Yeah.
They've already indicated that they're on par with the phase 3A results, which were astounding. And then, once that's in, I know the phase 3 study is complete. And so, next step is report and move to approval. So
can you imagine if that's,
it's huge.
Everyone I talked to said it's going to be very, very strong. And if that's the case, then I guess that kind of answers some of the questions that I've asked about institutions getting involved even more so. But last thing I'll leave, like we've discussed this at the top of the year about people, investors, they reached out, concerns about burn rate. We look at Cybin, they raised over 100 million. They have a little over 30 million left. Field Trip, I think they were close to 80 million at one time. So confidently, how is that progressing? And, you're going to say, yes, we can weather through the storm during the challenging times, but maybe provide our viewers and your investors just an update on where you sit, you think burn rate wise, and some of the changes that you've made already this year, and how confidently you're starting to feel moving forward as we, look to turn the corner in the next, whether it's 6, 9, or 12 months in the industry.
Yeah, the number one mandate of the company has been to reduce the burn rate and bring up profitability as quickly as possible. There's no question. And I think this year, last year, I think we demonstrated a lot of operational excellence and the ability to execute on our strategy. I think this year in particular, we're going to demonstrate the ability to get to tighten up that timeline, not only to profitability, but also show, what the full capability of the organization is from a growth standpoint as well. And so we've worked very hard to beat the burn rate down to $1 million a month. Well capitalized, that gets us a couple of years. And again, a couple of years, if all else stayed the same today, we see lots of opportunities to grow within the existing infrastructure that we've got. And we see a way to also grow the infrastructure in a way that doesn't bring on burn rate and greatly brings up the margins and profitability as well. And we're going to have MDMA, approved, I think, this time next year. So I think the company's in an excellent position. For investors looking at the space, there's going to be continued volatility, but I think you've seen, really, I think today, maybe I'll call today, with a little bit of swing on either side, but I would call today, close to the bottom in regards to consolidation. And I think moving forward from here, the opportunity is massive for the space, and we're excited and grateful to be able to be a part of it.
Well, drug development, what I'm seeing is that companies have to get to their phase 2B trial. Once they have good data, big pharma can come in and start sponsoring phase 3s, which we are heading that direction. Companies that are undercapitalized, you're going to start to see companies like yourselves and others that are well capitalized start gobbling up competition, looking at IP that looks, attractive for their portfolio. But I think that's the big thing, is that you're now going into a stage where the well-capitalized companies want to become portfolio companies. And I think that's where we're at. But like you said, you're well-capitalized for the next 2 years if nothing changes. But we discussed a number of things that I think is really going to turn the corner for this industry over the next year. Listen, appreciate the update. Great feedback as usual. And I'll let you get back to work.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Good
Thanks,
to see
Payton.
you.
Take care.
You.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. And if you want to learn more about the emerging industries that we cover, then leave a comment below and let us know who you want us to interview, the questions you want asked, and the information that you want to learn. We want to hear from you. As usual, click on that bell for all notifications to get the latest information. share this video with your network, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we would not be here without you. Thanks for watching, everyone.